On December 2nd, 2025, the city of San Francisco filed a lawsuit that could fundamentally rewrite the rules of the American grocery store. They aren't just suing food giants for making us gain weight, they're suing them for being a public nuisance, alleging that companies like PepsiCo and General Mills use the literal tobacco playbook to engineer foods that are biologically addictive as cigarettes. Now, for decades, the fitness industry has focused almost exclusively on the individual, your macros, your discipline, your choices. We have to ask a harder question. Has the modern food environment itself become the primary barrier to health for most people? Today, we're dissecting the addiction claim, the data on how our food environment actually has changed over the last 50 years, and giving you the barbell medicine verdict on the trial of big food. Here's maybe the most striking part of the story. You probably haven't heard about it yet. As of early 2026, while legal trade journals and local San Francisco outlets are buzzing, the national news cycle has been pretty quiet outside of some cursory reporting. I'll leave you to speculate why this might be, but today we're breaking the silence. And to help me do that, it's the second most handsome doctor in North America, Dr. Austin Baraki. What's going on, man?
Hey, I'm doing okay. Intrigued by this story as well. Kicking off the new year strong with a back tweak that started immediately right at the first week of the year, but we're working through it, and
I,
we'll see what
I was
happens.
I was wondering why I was feeling strong.
There you
Like it's just
go.
like
That's
a
all it
balance of
takes.
power. Now, for the listeners at home, if you've read Michael Moss's book Hooked, which I believe I recommended some time ago, because I think I read it about 18 months ago. It's a really good read. It does a very good job at reporting on how the food environment has changed and maybe why. He basically drew a roadmap for a prosecutor, maybe an enterprising, aggressive prosecutor to follow, and looks like somebody did. So we're going to follow the details of this case because this is about to break wide open, and we'll see what happens. So we have to understand that for the last 30 to 50 years, big food has been winning in court by using the personal responsibility defense. They basically argue if you are overweight, it is because you made a choice. For example, in a 2002 case, Pellman versus McDonald's, that case failed because they relied on consumer protection laws regarding failure to warn consumers about possible dangers, among others. Judges typically dismiss cases like this by stating that since the calories and ingredients are on the label, the consumer was responsible for the outcome. But San Francisco is trying to flip the script. Instead of suing on behalf of one person, the city is suing on behalf of the public. They're claiming that these companies have created a public nuisance, and this is a massive legal shift. Now, we're not lawyers here, so I actually did phone a friend to try to get some
Oh, nice.
input here. So this is the same strategy that was used to break big tobacco in the 90s and the opioid manufacturers more recently. It moves the argument away from did you choose to eat this to did these companies knowingly create a toxic environment that has cost the city, in this case, billions in healthcare. It's the first municipality to sue major manufacturers, so Coca-Cola, PepsiCo, General Mills, Kraft Heinz, et cetera, under this public nuisance statute. Now, under California law, a public nuisance is anything which is injurious to health so as to interfere with the comfortable enjoyment of life or property by an entire community or neighborhood. So, by using this statute, the city doesn't have to prove that one person was tricked into eating a cookie. They only have to prove that the industry's collective behavior has created a health crisis, so like obesity, diabetes, and heart disease. And it's so pervasive that it interferes with the public's right to a healthy environment and costs the city billions in healthcare. Now, this may sound familiar depending on how old you are and you're listening to this, because in the 90s, the Tobacco Master Settlement Agreement was achieved precisely because states stopped suing on behalf of individual smokers and started suing for the public cost of treating smoking related illnesses. The San Francisco lawsuit uses the exact same logic for metabolic disease. They also cite in the court proceedings the recent opioid litigation, so like the 2019 Johnson and Johnson ruling in Oklahoma. As you know, Dr. Baraki, cities and states have successfully used public nuisance claims against opioid manufacturers. The courts found that aggressively marketing a known addictive substance created a nuisance that the public, not just the individual user, had to pay for. And what's interesting to me is that the core economic argument here is that big food has been privatizing the profits while externalizing the costs. They make billions, basically due to subsidized crops, and they engineer a bliss point, which we'll talk about later, in their foods that drive overconsumption. But the public has been paying the price. And the city argues that local governments are the ones stuck with the astronomical healthcare costs. They're fitting the bill for type 2 diabetes, cardiovascular disease, obesity, and so on. Now, Austin, you and I spent a lot of time talking about behavior change and self efficacy. And when you look at the legal parallels between cigarettes, opioids, and these ultra processed foods, do you think the medical community has been too slow to acknowledge that for many of our patients, choice is being subverted by a carefully designed toxic food environment? Or do you worry that this legal theory overshoots the biological reality of how food actually works?
Yeah, great topic for discussion. I think this is a deeply asymmetrical relationship that you've laid out here. We, as you said, big fans of self efficacy and promoting healthful behavior change among people, but that's the extent of our power in this, again, deeply asymmetric relationship. And so we do have to be kind of honest, realistic, and based in the evidence around what food practices look like, what eating practices look like, how this whole process plays out. And so, there was the original theory of this is just personal choice. People are free to go about their day to day, whether at the grocery store, wandering around their house with their pantry, their fridge, and just deliberately, consciously, rationally choosing every morsel that they end up consuming. Well, it turns out that there's a lot more of this, what we'll call more automatic eating behavior. There's a lot of biological contributors that are less within our conscious control than we would like. And so, I do tons of weight management related medicine, and I have these conversations with patients all the time. And it's less me telling them this and more them telling me about their experience that directly reflects, how much control do they feel they have? And it might be that they have some short-term control. I can choose to do this thing for a period of time, but longer term, the biology seems to win out. And so that's kind of reflective of the fact that many of our day-to-day behaviors and activities, especially around food, are not nearly as conscious, rational choices as we like to think. They're more these subconscious outputs that are kind of automated in some way. They are responding to environmental cues and like nudges, if you will, including what's available in our environment. And then, of course, that aspect of sensory engineering that you kind of allude to with the way that these food companies put these products together to really just light up certain aspects of our brain and make it even easier for it to be an automatic behavior to reach for that over something that might be more health promoting, because they have much more appeal kind of packed into their product. And this is kind of what's been termed the so-called bliss point of that, like kind of perfect nirvana bite that they're trying to engineer to keep people coming back. And interestingly, it's not so blissful that you immediately get satisfied by that one thing. It's supposed to be this like moment of bliss that is so transient that it wants to keep you coming back over and over and over again. So I think that obviously, as you alluded to, us not being lawyers, the legal aspect of this is something I'm a little bit more reticent to comment confidently on. But I think that if we tie it back to the underlying biology here, there's a lot less of the oversimplistic kind of a simple personal choice narrative than the food companies' lawyers would like there to be.
Yeah. And I think people are going to hear us say that, hey, look, most of your food related practices are the result of subconscious sort of integrations of not only your cultural conditioning, but what's in your current environment, current, sensorium. People will say, well, look, we're just arguing for like hard determinism. Free will is a myth and whatever. And people are like, so no, just no agency or what? It's like, no, no, no. You have some free will here. You do, but we have to move past this binary free will versus determinism. I think a better framework is probabilistic automaticity. And we can draw a little parallel here to your training environment. So think of your Dr. Baraki here. You got a home gym, you got a rack, you got a bar, you got some plates. The probability of Dr. Baraki hitting his workout is high. All of the behavioral levers, if you will, are moved in his favor. He doesn't have to pack a bag, doesn't have to fight traffic or wait for a squat rack. It's right there. Still has to choose to lift the bar, but the environment has made that choice the path of least resistance, or at least lower resistance. Now imagine the opposite. The commercial gym after work, the first Monday of the new year. The GPS says it's going to take you 30 minutes to get to the gym due to traffic. And when you get to the gym, the parking lot's full, so you got to park up the street and hoof it to get in. Then when you're there, all the squat racks are taken, full of people doing weird stuff they saw on TikTok. Plus, you got to walk past a row of massage chairs, a juice bar selling an 800-calorie recovery shake, and a wall of TVs designed to distract you. Oh, and by the way, you got to be home soon to eat dinner, prep for tomorrow, and get to bed on time. Now, your free will is telling you to lift, but the environment is throwing in all these roadblocks to nudge you towards a lower effort, higher cost choice, skipping the workout. Now, imagine if these roadblocks were ever present, ubiquitous in your environment, and precisely engineered to know just how to throw you off your game. Probabilistic automaticity means that while you can make the right choice, the industry has spent billions of dollars making sure that statistically most people won't, and you probably won't all the time either. They haven't taken away your free will, they've just made the healthy choice more expensive or more costly in terms of cognitive effort and actual literal price, and they make the ultra processed choice free or lower cost. And that's the perfect segue into the actual data, because when we talk about the environment being rigged, we aren't just speaking metaphorically. We have the numbers to prove how the terrain has changed in the past few decades. So when the city of San Francisco calls big food a nuisance, they're effectively describing a toxic food environment. And I think we should be clear about what that means. Your food environment isn't just what's in your pantry, it's the combination of availability, affordability, convenience, and promotion within your immediate community, usually defined as like a 1 mile radius around your home or place of work. But this is actually expanding because it's no longer just what's in your immediate vicinity. With the rise of delivery apps, which is now a $30 billion a year industry, the food environment has expanded digitally. Nearly 2/3 of Americans now have high calorie, ultra processed nuisances available at the touch of a button 24/7, which has fundamentally changed the effort to reward ratio that used to influence human eating behavior. It's far easier now to get a high calorie meal delivered right to your door with just a few flicks of the screen. Now, if we look at the period between 1977 and the early 2000s, the average adult's daily energy intake increased by over 500 calories per day. Now, that shift correlates almost perfectly with the rise of ultra processed foods, which now make up an estimated 70% of the US food supply. And besides just the processing of the food actually changing, portion sizes have swelled. Since the 1970s, the American hamburger and soda have grown 2 to 5 times in size. We have cookies on the market that exceed the FDA's established portion sizes by 700%. And the portion size has important implications on how many calories people consume. Research shows that when you double a portion size, people spontaneously eat about 35% more calories, not just because they decided to, but because the automatic part of the brain doesn't register the extra energy when the food matrix is processed this heavily. So if you believe that the obesity epidemic is a failure of willpower or intelligence, you have to answer a very difficult question. Did the American population suddenly become less disciplined or significantly dumber since the 1970s? Did we experience a massive nationwide genetic mutation in character over the last 50 years? Of course not. Human willpower and intelligence have not meaningfully changed in the last 5 decades, but what has changed is the environment. We're the same biological organisms that we were in the 70s, but we are now living in a food environment designed for our pleasure. And so the results are predictable. Now, Austin, how widely accepted do you think the role of the food environment is amongst clinicians and also the public?
I think there's a lot of variation here, and to some extent, it depends on who you talk to. This is definitely a topic that has become more well recognized recently. And say what you will about, some of the recent political movements in the health space, but this is one area where I think they're onto something. Now, as far as what the core problem is and how to address it is where there's more likely to be disagreements between us and them. But at least identifying that, hey, this environment is problematic, and what should we do about it is where there's room for a subsequent discussion. I think the other aspect is even when clinicians do recognize the role of the food environment, or people do recognize it themselves, there's also this sometimes feeling of powerlessness over what am I able to do about this? How modifiable is it in the context of not just my immediate environment, like you said, not just the pantry, but everything in the 1 mile radius, now with the digital environment that surrounds us even further, and then situate that in the context of their lives where they have busy work schedules and maybe impaired sleep that weakens their resolve to try to stick to certain plans, or they have kids that they're trying to juggle, and all sorts of other, again, roadblocks and barriers that make that path of least resistance stronger and stronger in one direction. And so, there are certainly some situations where, hey, you and I have both had to, quote unquote, take advantage of some of the aspects of the food environment that maybe aren't so ideal, but were kind of helpful for us in that moment. It might not have been the most healthful choice, but were kind of what helped us get by in those particular moments. Now, the issue, of course, is when this becomes a more pervasive pattern in somebody's life over longer periods of time. And so there are certainly pros and cons, but yeah, there's no doubt that the human genetics, as much as you hear about people including us, talk about the kind of genetic susceptibility towards obesity, a lot of people say, yeah, but genetics haven't changed. And it's like, yeah, but those genes are evolved for a different environment. And so you can't separate the genes from the environment. They are, one is situated in the other. And so, fully agree that the environment is the core problem. And that's part of why, because of how difficult it has been for us to change, that's why we're kind of stuck working on the individual level a lot of the time, talking about things like self-efficacy and behavior change and the use of medications like GLP-1s and metabolic surgery and things like that at the level of the individual, because the bigger picture, the system, is so much more difficult for us to meaningfully modify.
Yeah. Yeah, I do think that there's been this shift from like it's not a shift away from personal responsibility, but a shift away from just trying harder. Like there's more recognition of other influences here. This, gene environment mismatch that's, being, it's really an experiment that's been playing out right in front of our eyes. And so, yeah, I do think that shifting away from quote just trying harder, telling people to, yeah, just eat less, move more. I think that's been generally positive, mostly because it's a poor strategy against this rigged system. But I want to look at exactly who rigged it and how they did so. So when San Francisco calls these companies a quote public nuisance, they're looking at decades of documented participation in shaping our modern food environment. So if we go back to the 1980s, Philip Morris and R.J. Reynolds, the two biggest tobacco companies in the world, well, they bought the American Pantry. They acquired Kraft, General Foods, and Nabisco. And they didn't just bring their money, they brought their scientists. They took the people who spent decades optimizing nicotine delivery and rate of absorption and put them to work on mouthfeel and Bliss Point. They applied the same hyper-targeting marketing strategies they use for cigarettes to sell sugary snacks to children. It's the same marketing team that made Joe Camel a household name, who designed Lunchables and Capri Sun. Then let's fast forward to 1999. We're in Minneapolis at the headquarters for Pillsbury. 11 CEOs met to discuss the obesity epidemic. Now, Michael Mudd, VP from Kraft, warned them that they were being compared to tobacco companies. He explicitly warned them that they needed to address the obesity epidemic by reducing sugar and scaling back marketing. The response? The CEO of General Mills, Steven Sanger, responded by saying, "Don't talk to me about nutrition, talk to me about taste." It certainly seems like they knew harm was coming and they chose to double down on hyperpalatability anyway. And I think it's a mistake to think that the industry's influence just stops at the chemistry of the food, because once they established the intent to maximize the bliss point, they had to ensure the environment made those products the path of least resistance. They didn't just modify the food environment, they built an infrastructure that essentially mandates overconsumption. Through lobbying, they ensured that corn, soy, and wheat became the most subsidized crops on earth. The price of these processed, shelf-stable foods has remained incredibly stable and cheap for the last 40 years, while the price of fresh produce has shown volatility. When a snack cake consistently is cheaper than a head of broccoli, the choice for a family on a budget has been subverted by economic policy before they even enter the store. They also engineered the retail environment. Checkout lanes and end cap displays are not accidents of store layout. They are prime real estate sold via slotting fees. 70% of food and beverage options at store checkouts are unhealthy, increasing to 89% for snack size items. And these tend to be more prominent at less expensive stores. These are the high traffic sensory traps designed to trigger automaticity when a person is at their most tired or distracted. Now, Austin, we've laid out how the industry essentially has built this food environment, rigging the economics through subsidies and engineering the physical environment to catch us when we're tired or distracted. But as a doctor who deals with metabolic health and obesity every day, you know that the final battle isn't happening at the checkout lane, it's happening in the brain. Now, the industry has a North Star for this engineering called the Bliss Point. Based on what we know about how the body actually signals fullness, how does a precisely engineered food effectively mute those signals to ensure that we keep eating long after our biological needs are met? Is this like a negative food matrix effect?
In the sense that it is an engineered food matrix, a lot of the times it is. And a good way to think about this is, if you are somebody who is feeling a little hungry for your next meal, and you can imagine yourself sitting down for a meal of a variety of all of your favorite foods, compared with a single meal of, let's say, plain boiled potatoes with like no seasoning, nothing else. To the extent that you have an appetite and like true energy needs, you might eat a certain amount of those. And then when you're tapped out, you're done. There's a whole host of mechanisms that might lead you to say, okay, I'm satisfied at this point. There's no further appeal to me in consuming more. But when you have a whole variety of all of your favorite foods in front of you that you can switch between, that offer different mechanical, textural experiences, flavor experiences that you can go back and forth between, then suddenly the total calorie intake of that meal might expand substantially beyond your energy requirements. So there are a variety of different pathways that can impact this sensation of fullness or satiation and satiety. So there's things like mechanical stretch, for example, how full physically your stomach is, and that has some neuro kind of signal transduction into certain hormones and things like that. There's also this concept I alluded to called sensory specific satiety, where if you're having a variety of complex flavors versus just like a single thing where bite after bite after bite is exactly the same thing with no variation involved. And then there's, of course, individual level, what we'll call hedonic kind of pathways, your personal preferences and cravings and the things that you as an individual tend to enjoy that can easily override your pure energy needs because the reward value of a particular food might be just so high. There's many more things that we could get into, of course, but I think that intuitively, if you think about that meal of a bowl of just plain old boiled potatoes, unless you're somebody who really loves that, versus a multi-course spread at Thanksgiving with appetizers and entrees and desserts and a little bit try a little bit of every single thing throughout the evening, and it's stretched out and there's social aspects involved and there's alcohol involved and various other things, then suddenly the raw energy intake can be dramatically different. And we can call it a food matrix effect. We can just call it an entire food environmental kind of experiential matrix effect that can lead to significant mismatches between your pure energy calorie requirements versus what ends up actually being consumed.
Yeah. Even if you just focus on like the potato continuum, if you will, you got like boiled potatoes all the way on one side. It's, the least processed form. It is cooked, right? And yeah, you get a relatively simple flavor profile, mouthfeel, etc., right? And then, all right, so now we're going to take a cooked potato and we're going to add some seasoning to it and some toppings, right? So it's a little more tasty, a little more complex, a little bit more likely to cause an increase in calorie consumption because we're evolutionarily we've migrated towards these behaviors where we seek out things that we know have a lot of energy in them. That's kind of what we've been designed to do. Okay, and so now we go from the potato with some toppings on it to, ooh, well, what if we fry it?
Hmm.
What if we fry it and we tweak, the sodium, the salt content and the fat content in just a certain way? Like, ooh, well, now it's even more. Ooh, well, what if we engineer the mouthfeel to be like crunchy or like melt in your mouth? And it goes even further on the continuum. And you ultimately end up at like whatever your tastiest sort of potato chip is or French fry variation. And it's like, well, yeah, no kidding. You're going to consume more calories from that compared to the bowl of boiled potatoes. Does that make sense
Hmm.
to you?
100%. That's exactly it.
Yeah, so I think an engineered food matrix, I kind of like that. And maybe it's just a bad one because you could theoretically engineer it the other way. Like,
Yep.
a food matrix got a ton of micronutrients in it and fiber and protein and whatever. But this is, yeah, maybe a bad food matrix effect. And ultimately, the goal from the food industry here is to achieve that bliss point. Now, this was a term that was coined by Howard Moskowitz. He's an American market researcher and psychophysicist. And this is the point where the levels of saltiness, sweetness, and richness were perceived by the consumer to be just right. So you can think of this food matrix effect by comparison, this steak or a head of broccoli. They got built in stoplights, structural components like intact fiber and complex proteins that force your body to do work. These elements regulate the speed of digestion and they send clear signals to your brain that says, hey, look, we've had enough. But when the industry dismantles that matrix, they're not just making the food easier to eat, they're clearing a path for a specific sensory payload. They take that blank molecular canvas and they engineer this bliss point that overrides the brain's stop signals. In a whole food environment, your body's got brakes. But in this ultra processed food environment or food experience, the industry has turned all the stoplights to green and they cut the brake lines. They've created a product that provides maximum reward with little biological feedback. We've got some decent data on this. Dr. Kevin Hall, he's a titan in the space. He did this experiment that showed that even when we control for single nutrients, people on average will eat about 500 more calories of ultra processed foods per day. Now, Austin, I want you to unpack that. If this isn't just a simple sugar spike or something like that, or insulin spike, what is actually happening between these engineered foods and the brain that makes these calories so invisible to our satiety system? And why is that such a problem?
Yeah, I don't actually think that we have a super clear understanding on this just yet. I think if you ask Dr. Hall that, who I've heard him be asked this type of question, he finds it super intriguing. And there are some hypotheses and some ideas, but we still don't have a perfect understanding of this. To the extent we do have some ideas, it can inform some potential ideas for things that we can do, mainly in the realm of like what's called food reformulation, trying to make products that do hit these satiation centers and things like that. Of course, the challenge then is, well, what's the incentive for food companies to do that, to make foods that are more filling and satisfying that people are going to consume less of? But we know, for example, that when there's less bulk, fiber, water content, of course, there's less of that mechanical stretch that's going to happen in the stomach and downstream hormonal signaling. If there's foods that even melt in your mouth, then don't even require chewing. We know that people tend to spontaneously consume more calories from, sugar sweetened beverages that go down quick and easy and are tasty and carbonated and cold and things like that, compared with, other forms of equivalent calorie expenditure intake, excuse me. And then, yeah, all of this downstream hormonal signaling, we can see a lot of these things when they are measured. Not all of them show meaningful differences. Some of them do. And then the question is, well, how much of a role are these even playing? Is it kind of an epi phenomenon? Is it's happening at the same time, but not driving the difference in intake? Or is it actually driving the difference in intake? And so that means that should be a target for intervention. So I do not have a confident answer for this, and I don't actually think that anybody does. That's why Dr. Kevin Hall's research was so useful and important, and why it is so unfortunate that he is not currently doing any more of that research by virtue of having been kind of pushed out of the NIH this past year. But that is a prime area for us to get better understanding. And then from there, we need to, on a different level than setting up the food environment for people, we almost need to set up the business environment for companies to be able to spontaneously formulate foods that achieve the health goals that we're looking for the public. There are so many layers of complexity there and policy there that are well beyond our expertise, but it's an interesting way to think about it. Is like, we need to identify these variables, figure out which ones are most potent in terms of achieving the impacts we're looking for, and then set up that business environment so that it becomes the natural, rational path of least resistance for these companies to make the products that are compatible with our public health goals.
Yeah. Yeah, that's actually, it raises an interesting question for the lawsuit against Big Food, because the food industry's defense isn't just, hey, look, we make tasty food. Their defense is that they're simply following the rules. They're meeting every USDA and FDA guideline for shelf stable, fortified, and convenient foods. But if our regulatory bodies don't even recognize the food matrix and the satiety profile of foods as important variables, are the companies the villains, or are they just taking the most efficient path in a flawed game? Now, we're going to take a quick break to hear from our sponsors, but when we come back, we're moving from the intent of the manufacturers to the physical toll on the consumer. We're going to look at the 14% of adults who meet the criteria for food addiction and the hard data on just how much this flawed game is hurting us. Stick around. All right, welcome back to the Barbell Medicine Podcast. Before the break, we were talking about the Bliss Point and how the food industry has essentially hacked human satiety. But the San Francisco lawsuit isn't just arguing that this engineering makes food hard to stop eating. They're making the legal claim that these products are also addictive. And the data suggests that they aren't exaggerating. According to research by Gearhart in 2022, 14% of adults and 12% of children now meet the clinical criteria for food addiction using the Yale Food Addiction Scale. This scale applies the same DSM-5 criteria used for alcohol and tobacco, things like loss of control, continued use despite harm, and intense cravings to continue these food practices. Now, to put that statistic into perspective, that is a prevalence rate that's comparable to alcohol use disorder, and it's significantly higher than tobacco use disorder. So this suit argues that the industry's bliss point, again, that perfect ratio of salt, sugar, and fat, is engineered to hit the brain's reward center so hard and so fast that it decouples eating from actual calorie needs. So the lawsuit sits right in the middle of a major academic divide regarding food addiction. And there are two major theories here. The first model is the substance model, where addictive substances are rarely single agents, just as cigarettes are a complex mixture engineered to deliver nicotine as fast as possible, while highly processed foods are complex mixtures of refined carbohydrates and fats designed for rapid absorption. Here, the food is the drug. And then there's the second model. This is the behavioral model. So again, true substance use disorders require a single identifiable chemical compound that directly activates the central nervous system, like nicotine, ethanol, or cocaine. In the food world, well, we haven't found that nicotine. People don't abuse pure sugar or butter outside of like some weird social media trends. Instead, they overconsume a wide variety of foods that differ in texture, flavor, and composition. Therefore, the addiction isn't to a substance, it's to the act of eating in a specific context. So, for example, after food restriction and weight loss, humans and rodents' behavior usually changes to a markedly increase intake in calories. And this isn't because the food has changed, it's because the physiological state of the person or the rodent has changed. So, what we're calling addiction is actually the brain's natural homeostatic response to dieting or restriction. And the environment, in this case, triggers a specific uncontrolled pattern of eating behaviors. So, this particular model favors like addictive like behaviors or uncontrolled eating. Now, Austin, I tend to favor this behavioral model here. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I agree. I think it's maybe a little bit feels too straightforward because when you look at the substance model, you're right that people don't just sit in front of a bowl of pure granulated sugar and just binge on that or drink a gallon of olive oil or something like that. Not only that, but people will end up developing, say, obesity and its associated complications when it comes from overconsumption of certain foods. There's a wide variation in the types of foods that people tend to consume. So it cannot be a single substance model when there's so much variation. Whereas with alcohol, it's like, yeah, there's different forms, be it wine or liquor or beer or something else, but we have identified the specific component in there, the ethanol, that is driving the behaviors. And so, of course, there's also psychosocial context and all sorts of things around the use of that substance, but the ethanol itself is the kind of the determining substance there. And that is what we don't have for food. So different people get there through different means, but kind of the commonality is the experience. And so that's why I think I agree that the behavioral model is by far the better explanation compared with a single substance model. Now, the individual aspects of these substances, the sweetness, the saltiness, the savoriness, the satiating value or lack thereof, all of those things do play roles as well. But I don't think that we're ever going to identify, oh, this is the single, food component or certainly like nutrient that contributes to overconsumption.
Yeah, the substance model is interesting because again, it almost requires like a specific mixture, right? Of yeah, maybe it's a specific mixture of salt, fat, acid, whatever, and sugar, which would maybe support that, but then you're still taking it out of the context,
Mhm.
right, and out of the environment, which I think it plays a very strong role. So it'd be hard to be like a hard substance model person and just
Yeah.
ignore the behavior stuff. So yeah, is it as far as it appearing relatively straightforward? I think it's because we recognize that the context is important, but
Mhm.
people can be forgiven for saying, well, look, it doesn't have to be a single nutrient, but like it can be a combination of things. And I feel like that's reasonable, but yeah, you can't remove it from the context. Now, here's where things get even more interesting. Now, look, if only 14% of adults meet this clinical criteria for addiction and ignoring any potential problems with that definition, well, that leaves 86% of individuals with obesity who don't. So, why is addiction a major part of this lawsuit? Well, in a public nuisance case, you don't have to prove that everyone has an addiction to food and that subsequently causes harm. You only have to prove that the manufacturer knowingly created a product that subverts the health of a significant proportion of the community. You can think of it like a dangerous bridge. If a bridge is engineered and built so poorly that 14% of cars drive off the edge of the bridge, we don't say, well, look, 86% of people made it across, so the bridge is fine. We fixed the bridge. Now, the 14% of folks who meet this Yale food addiction criteria are the canaries in the coal mine here. They prove that the product has the biological capacity to override human agency. Now, once that is established, the industry's personal responsibility defense, the idea that everyone is just choosing what to eat, collapses. So you establish that the bridge is broken, that human agency is being overridden. The next logical question for the court is, what is the actual damage? In a public nuisance case, you have to prove special injury or widespread harm to the community. And there's some pretty good evidence here. A recent British medical journal umbrella review of nearly 10 million people is helpful at assessing the cost of the modern food environment. So, high intake of ultra processed foods is associated with a 50% increased risk of cardiovascular disease related death. For every 10% increase in the proportion of ultra processed foods in the diet, that's associated with a 12% increased risk of type 2 diabetes, a dose dependent relationship there. There's a 55% higher risk of obesity, 22% higher risk of major depressive disorder, and a number of other common medical conditions all increase with increased consumption of ultra-processed foods. Now, if you read the headlines on this, they often claim these risks remained even after researchers adjusted for total calorie intake and BMI, which is unlikely, if not implausible. The industry's defense is always, well, correlation doesn't equal causation. These people just have bad lifestyles. But in a public nuisance case, you don't need a single smoking gun. You need a preponderance of evidence. When nearly 10 million people show that every 10% increase in these foods correlates to a 12% jump in type 2 diabetes, the lifestyle excuse starts to look a lot like a cover story for a rigged deck. Now, Austin, there's another layer here. Many of these studies try to adjust for calorie intake and then claim that the harm still exists, but we know that self-reported dietary data is notoriously unreliable. People consistently underreport their energy intake, especially when it comes to highly processed foods that they're, quote, addicted to or otherwise over-consuming. If the primary nuisance of these foods is that they drive a massive spontaneous calorie surplus, does it even make sense to try and find a risk independent of calories? Are we missing the forest for the trees by ignoring that overeating is the harm?
Yeah, I think that you're right that underreporting of calories is super common in the same way that overreporting of energy expenditure through exercise is also common. We have direct data looking at this where the randomizing groups to receive these ultra processed predominant diets versus more quote unquote whole food diets leads to this spontaneous overconsumption. So you're right that the overeating is the spontaneous result. It is quite apparent. It is very difficult to refute or deny at this point. I do think that there is some increase in risk independent of calories. And for example, we have evidence that we are able to make health promoting food substitutions and swaps that lead to improvements in health outcomes, even if people don't lose weight, for example. That's a well known phenomenon. But I do think that the bigger kind of beast that we're wrangling with here is the overall energy intake and its impact on body mass and the downstream consequences of excess adiposity.
Yeah. Yeah. I think the biggest lever that's changing is that, look, people are spontaneously consuming more calories, and that's
Hmm.
due to the engineering of the food. But that doesn't mean that nothing else is going on under the
Right.
hood. Like if
Right.
you strip out enough fiber and then you took that same group of people and you had them add in foods that had more fiber, but they didn't lose any weight or didn't change calorie consumption, we'd likely see some health benefits.
Hmm.
Those would be modest compared to if this also controlled for energy intake.
Exactly. Yes.
Yeah. So to me, overeating is kind of the feature here. But this brings us to the ultimate pragmatic question for 2026. If the core problem is that these foods have broken our internal satiety meters and we see this body count mounting in the data, why are we waiting on a 10-year legal battle to fix the food supply? We've got these GLP-1 medications and other anti-obesity medications that literally bridge that signaling gap pharmacologically. Is this lawsuit a slow motion solution to a biological problem that we've already solved?
I think it is a potential solution, but also the pragmatic aspects of this create challenges, and it's part of why I think attacking these from both ends is worthwhile. What I mean by that is that yeah, we have essentially quote unquote solved this biologically or pharmacologically with the medicines, but we're still faced with the practical reality of like, okay, so is our solution to continue letting the food environment run rampant and get every single human on one of these medicines? Some people, some companies, in fact, would love that idea. I think there are a lot of challenges to that, both cost, financial, tolerability. Not everybody can safely take these medicines for various reasons, things like that. And so, to the extent we can address the food environment, I mean, that's the bigger umbrella aspect of this whole situation that for some people, still not for everyone, but for some people would obviate the need for the medicines or, attacking it on an individual level. People are just super different. Some people, even with a perfect food environment, will manage to develop obesity. This has been recognized as long as recorded history has existed. And those folks are the ones who are most likely to benefit from these anti-obesity treatments and metabolic bariatric surgery and things like that. It's only once the environment reaches this critical level that we're at right now, where a much larger swath of the population ends up being impacted. And that big additional swath, those are the people who, yep, they can benefit from these medicines. I see it and do it every day in practice. But also, if we did manage to shift the environment substantially, they might not need them either. And so, kind of like, it's worth attacking this both ways.
Yeah. Yeah. I think we obviously agree on that. And I think most people would agree. Yeah, por qué no los dos? Let's do both
Yeah.
here. Um, But when you start thinking about what would be needed to meaningfully change the food environment, you're like, okay, so yeah, this lawsuit has to be won. And then there needs to be a massive overhaul of like subsidies, food company manufacturing practices, and then the built environment. Like so many things would need to change, and like how long that would take if it
Hmm.
even was accepted, and like
Yeah.
all these things were like, it's almost like you're paying lip service to it. You're like, yeah, yeah, no, we should do that for sure, but like pretty skeptical that anything would change enough to really again obviate the need for, hey, nobody needs to be on GLP-1s
Right.
anymore because the food environment's awesome. Like on
Yeah,
our lifetime.
I don't see that as a realistic end state. But and you're right that there's the complexity of both a very legalistic, litigious society that kind of bogs things down for years to decades at a time, working through those types of processes. And then there's also the cultural component, right? There, like in the U.S. at least, the culture of very strong individualism, and I get to choose whatever I want to the extent that they're actually choosing, et cetera. You contrast that because there are other societies around the world that have much more favorable food environments and built environments around them for exercise and spontaneous physical activity and all sorts of other sorts of things. But the idea that we're going to transpose that onto our society and that it will work and be accepted and get rapid uptake and things like that, yeah, super, super unlikely. So I agree that the realistic, kind of from a pragmatic perspective, and that's why the medicines are doing what they are right now, whereas the state of our food environment is not like meaningfully improving, I would say, day to day, week to week, or year to year.
Can you imagine? So let's go to bizarro world here. The lawsuit is one. Okay. Policies changed. The incentives for food manufacturers also change, right? And everything just overnight, you made wave a magic wand, boom, it's different. It's perfect. The food environment is. People still are going to remember these hyper
Yeah.
palatable foods.
Yeah.
Is this like a prohibition era like type thing? It starts popping up. You go, there's like a speakeasy, but it's for like snacks. Like,
Yeah, people are going to be ordering, these things off eBay from like, years prior when they still used to make this particular food product.
oh, you
Yeah, totally.
you got Twinkies, bro? Yeah. Where did you get these?
Yeah.
So we've established that the current food environment is problematic, but if we're going to fix it, or if the court's going to regulate it, we have to define what it is. And right now, the legal and scientific world is obsessed with the NOVA food classification system. We've talked about this a few times, but NOVA, it's not an acronym. It's just a four-letter word. It's capitalized, oddly, for some unknown reason, that groups foods into four categories, with group four being ultra-processed. But this is problematic from two major perspectives. First, classifying a high quality whey protein isolate or ultra filtered milk in the same category as an Oreo just because they're both group 4 ultra processed foods is like saying a bicycle and a Boeing 747 are the same because they both contain metal. One is an engineered tool designed for a specific performance or health outcome, and the other is an engineered trap for overconsumption. By lumping them together, we aren't helping people change their behavior, we're just confusing them. Because the public doesn't really understand this anyway. This is the second point. And even if they did, does it really change behavior to just know better? Most people know that broccoli is healthier than a Twinkie, irrespective of intricate knowledge regarding processing or the NOVA food classification system. But that doesn't stop them from eating the Twinkie. So just imagine if we labeled all of these ultra processed foods group 4. It's like a red sign on the
Mhm.
front. Is that meaningfully going to change food behavior?
There are some countries that have experimented with the so-called traffic light system, and there is some impact on food-related behaviors. Whether that is enough to, again, just shift the entire population's risk profile, drop, population-wide BMIs by a few points, put diabetes into remission, less and less likely. But I also don't think that it's realistic to expect that a single intervention like that is itself going to be, unlocking, this entire problem. It's likely going to be multi-pronged, multifactorial, incremental benefits from a variety of different things, whether
Yeah.
labeling, reformulation, all sorts of other things that, could be trialed.
Yeah. You're not going to get a 20% benefit from one thing. You're going to get a 1% benefit from 20 things. You got to do
There you
all of
go.
them to make a
Yep.
significant difference.
Yeah.
And I think the core issue here regarding, processing and narratives around just don't eat any processed foods is that processing isn't just one thing. So there can be functional processing, which includes things like freezing vegetables or making Greek yogurt or making canned beans, shelf stable or ultra filtered milk. Yeah, they're processed, but the processing is used to improve shelf life, convenience, and nutrient density without necessarily hacking your satiety signals. And then there's hyperpalatable processing. Now, this is the nuisance. These are products engineered for that bliss point, stripping the fiber out, adding the perfect ratio of salt, sugar, and fat purely to drive consumption. They're both processing, they're just different and lead to different outcomes. So let's say that the NOVA system is refined to a satisfactory level, properly identifying only the foods that cause unique harm through overeating and any other unique mechanisms. That would be awesome, right? Well, our food supply would have more satiety stoplights, so less people would be likely to overeat, and all would be well in the world. We have this magic wand, we wave it and make every calorie in America minimally processed. We would likely see a massive, spontaneous reversal in the obesity epidemic. But there's a catch. Sure, it's generally better for humans to eat a minimally processed whole food diet, but we have to be careful to not turn health into a luxury good. If we tell everyone, avoid all group 4 foods, are we creating a health literacy barrier that only the wealthy can cross? Imagine a single parent living in a food desert and they can only afford group 4 shelf stable foods to feed their kids and their family. Are we as clinicians doing more harm by pathologizing their only accessible food source? In the real economy of 2026, fresh produce and minimally processed meats are increasingly expensive. By reducing access to all ultra-processed options, the cost of groceries could go up even more for folks who are currently the most victimized by this food environment. We're basically telling them that, look, you're poisoning yourself and you can't afford a whole food lifestyle, so tough luck. And this is why I get so frustrated with the silly targets that are currently hijacking the conversation. We got RFK Jr. focusing on red dye 40 and seed oils and removing the advice to reduce saturated fat intake in the latest guidelines, none of which help people make healthier food choices more accessible or more affordable. It just makes the still processed food more expensive. Focusing on food dye while ignoring a 500 calorie satiety gap is like trying to fix a sinking ship by repainting the lifeboats. The nuisance isn't the seed oil or the food dye. The nuisance is the engineered lack of satiety and the energy toxicity that has subsequently resulted. Now, Austin, if we spend our limited behavioral capital with patients telling them to hunt for red dye 40 or avoid canola oil, we don't have anything left to help them address the actual big levers like their microfood environments, their food preparation skills, and so on. So as a clinician, how do you help a patient navigate a world where minimally processed is the goal, but ultra processed is the reality? How do we give them a strategy that works for their budget without making them feel like their only affordable food options are a moral failure?
This is a very challenging question, and one that I don't think a lot of clinicians are necessarily very well equipped to address directly outside of the dietetics field, where they have much more extensive training in how to assess a patient, their current situation, their needs, and how best to achieve their goals for the best health outcomes and things like that. Because obviously, we can talk about this at multiple levels. We've already addressed it at the macro level, like the big food environment that we all live in, as well as what you described as kind of the more micro environment, your immediate surroundings. Those are different things that might require different strategies to help somebody work through. Recognizing that somebody's food and eating related behaviors are at least somewhat automatic and a little bit less consciously controlled than we would like. And also, there's all sorts of other influences, like what types of foods they grew up with, what types of foods they know how to prepare, what types of foods they prefer, and whether they have any experience making, eating, or even, ideally enjoying certain types of foods as well can be a perfectly healthy and normal part of life. And so when we're doing our own assessments and talking to patients, getting a sense of what does their habitual diet look like and what are some reasonable and accessible potential substitutions, because there are, in fact, highly economical options that can be substituted into people's diets to displace or substitute for some of the less health promoting options, but figuring out what those are on an individual level that fit their kind of cultural practices and what types of foods they are comfortable and have the access and the ability to prepare might be the challenge, right? So there have been these kind of guideline statements that have come out, over time that advise a very particular dietary pattern. Let's call one, for example, the Mediterranean diet. Well, if this person that I'm talking to is from, a village in rural Africa, or they're coming from, Southeast Asia or something, like these are just fundamentally different diets. And so it's very difficult to transpose one on the other and expect it to work. So when we look at, our most highly satiating foods, looking at things like very high foods with very high contents of fiber per calorie and things like that. We're looking at legumes are a very predominant aspect of my diet, your diet, a lot of the diets that we end up recommending. Certain types of seafood to the extent that that's accessible to the person. Frozen foods to include frozen vegetables and fruits, very common, very accessible for a lot of people. You mentioned ultra filtered milk. That has a little bit of a price premium on it compared with more traditional milk. It kind of depends on somebody's preferences and their tolerability, but definitely looking for these foods that are accessible to the person, preferable to them, that contain plenty of protein and fiber per calorie and are within their budgets and things like that. So those are some of the features that we might look for early on to find substitutions compared with what they're habitually consuming on a regular basis.
Yeah. And knowing you, and the way you go about, talking to a patient, interviewing them, you're leading more with open-ended questions. Tell me what you eat. What do you like to eat?
Hmm.
Tell me tell me about your cooking experience.
Yeah.
Basically trying to get a sense of where they're at to, again, find threads, opportunities for potential improvement, as well as opportunities to leverage the resources that they already have access to. Because you could lay out the perfect dietary pattern for somebody, make them a grocery list, macros, calories, the whole thing. And they're like, I don't know how to cook.
Right. Go back to
You know?
square one. Yeah.
Yeah, and it's like, yeah, you probably should have picked that up earlier. You don't
Hmm.
need the plan first. You need to, where is this person starting for? And then as the professional, help them navigate that roadmap, ultimately trying to make them more competent at navigating this environment. But yeah, most people jump right to the solution. And it's like, you sure this is like universally applicable or?
Yeah, I mean, to go back even further from where you were starting, my question is like, why is this person talking to me? Like, what led them to
Yeah.
talk to me today? Right? Because then, as I've talked about in many other contexts with behavior change, it's like trying to find what is the thing that I can advise that ties into something meaningful to you. Like, why do you care about this? And how can I make what I care about also something that you care about?
Yep. Yeah, exactly. And even if this whole the conversation just went sideways, the person recognizes that their dietary pattern could be improved. They recognize that they have some elements that are controllable and they can make those changes, right? But they can't make all of them or they can't make a significant amount of them just for whatever reason, right? Whether it's time, whether it's financial resources, so on and so forth. Um, that doesn't mean they can't get any benefit out of making some change, and perhaps they're more amenable to a different sort of health promoting behavior like increasing exercise, for example. If a person was originally there to talk to you about their weight and whatever, and then ultimately you couldn't come to a satisfactory resolution as far as this is our initial plan moving forward, it's checking all the boxes, it's the perfect patient.
Yep.
And you brought up, how do you feel about exercise? And they were like, yeah, I would be open to that. Like, again, you've just benefited this person and they've benefited their own trajectory there. So a lot of different options here to help them be more competent in navigating this environment. Now, we spent this whole episode talking about how the food industry has engineered a public health crisis, but lawsuits take years and your health is happening right now. We can't just wait for the courts to fix the food supply. We've got to take some action. So here are some strategies for navigating a rigged game. First off, we're starting in the grocery store. So if you have hyper palatable, ultra processed foods in your house, the really tasty treats, you're going to have to use willpower every single day to resist them. Your dietary RPE is going to be high, at least for most folks. But if you make a commitment to avoid buying those things in the first place, when you go to the grocery store, you only have to use your willpower budget once. If the bliss point isn't in your pantry, the environment can't exploit your satiety signals at 9 p.m. on a Tuesday when you're tired. Second part is going to be related to food preparation. Now, based on survey data, 6 out of 10 adults ate food from either a fast food or full service restaurant in the past 24 hours. And this is a problem that has mostly to do with calories. The more meals that are consumed from fast food or full service restaurants per week, the higher someone's BMI is on average. By contrast, the more meals that are prepared inside the home tend to be lower in calories, tend to have smaller portions, and are more satiating than when eating out. When you cook at home, you're the engineer. You're more in control than if you go to a restaurant. So spending some of this behavior change budget on learning how to prepare and store food, in addition to shifting towards preparing more meals at home in general, I think that'd be a good use of resources. The third part of this strategy is going to be changing your micro food environment. You can't really do much about the built environment around us, at least not in the short term, but we're trying to make the path of least resistance more healthy in the places you spend the most time. So we're trying to kind of add friction towards behaviors that we don't want while reducing friction to behaviors we do want. So again, if you have these hyper palatable snacks, maybe they're for the kids, you can't avoid buying them, or for guests that come in the home. Well, keep them out of sight. There's been some thought to place them in like opaque containers and place them high in the pantry, keeping them out of sight and out of mind, and ultimately reducing the marketing sort of drive or desirability drive. And instead, keeping high satiety tools, fruit, vegetables, ultra filtered milk, jerky, whatever, at eye level or otherwise easily accessible. And the office is often a high density food swamp of donuts and vending machines and other treats that people bring in. But you could treat your desk like a little micro oasis. You could bring your own protein powder, other high protein, high satiety snacks so that you aren't forced to rely on willpower in the break room. Presumably, you go to work on most days, so that would be a good change. And lastly, you can change the eating environment. This is something that people probably have the most control over. So when you're sitting there eating while scrolling your phone or watching TV, you're essentially muting your brain's ability to monitor satiety signals, feelings of fullness. You're increasing this biological blindness to how full you are, how many calories you're consuming. So we advise, or I advise often, trying to eat distraction free, no screens, all right, to allow both the mechanical and chemical stop signals to be heard and otherwise realized. And if eating at the same time also appears to have some benefit. So we eat at similar times each day. That tends to help regulate hunger hormones like ghrelin, for example. And your body starts knowing when to expect energy, how much energy it's getting. And so these spikes in hunger become more predictable and easier to manage, and ultimately can lead to more successful outcomes. Now, all of that in place, there are still going to be individuals in this modern environment that are going to have trouble regulating their body composition and their body weight to a level that sort of optimizes their health trajectory. So, Austin, what are some other interventions that can be useful here?
Yeah, a lot of this depends on the additional kind of details of the person. So to the extent that there are some of these experienced of psychological aspects around their eating behaviors, working with some form of a therapist or a dietitian might help to work through some of that person's individual issues, predispositions, tendencies, behavior patterns that they're having a little bit of difficulty kind of working through managing, or need some additional input on strategies to handle. What form of therapy or dietitian strategies that might involve are going to be super individualized. So that would be one place to start. Working with a physician around this, particularly if they have obesity or certainly obesity related complications, things like high blood pressure, cholesterol, cardiovascular disease, fatty liver disease, diabetes, et cetera. Those are stronger and stronger candidates for what we'll call higher intensity interventions, to include things like the medications, like GLP-1 receptor agonists, multi-agonists, and some of our other weight management related medicines, basically because the aim here is to improve people's health outcomes, improve their longevity, reduce the risk of complications related to obesity, and to give them essentially more control over their day-to-day life. And that is one of the most interesting and compelling things that I see and hear from patients that in whom I use these medicines now on a daily basis, where they tell me, look, I was able to lose weight repeatedly over the years. I've lost and regained the same 30, 50, 100 pounds multiple times over the years. I know how to do these things, but the use of this medicine gives me control to do and sustain those things that I already knew I needed to be doing, right? And so it makes it so that they don't have to have that high RPE, that daily, I have to wake up and go to war every day just to, avoid the things that that set them down the wrong path. Because to your point, I tell people a lot, if it's in the house, it's going down the hatch for a lot of people, and because of how automatic this is. So these tools give people more control and let them do the things they already know that they wanted and needed to do. And then finally, we have metabolic bariatric surgery, which I still am quite proud of that podcast episode that we did a couple years ago. I think it was an exceptional kind of overview of that topic. And I still think that it is an underutilized, under-referred for resource, particularly for those who have been struggling with this the most and for the longest. So these are some kind of higher level interventions, things that are worth discussing with your physician to see if they're appropriate for you if you're in this situation.
Yeah, I think a lot of this, reticence to maybe use medications or therapy or metabolic bariatric surgery, accessing that has to do with this sort of like moral underpinning to
Mhm.
like, it matters how you got there. Well, how
Yep.
did you lose the weight? How did you maintain the weight loss? And it's like, look, if these, pick yourself up by the bootstraps sort of efforts, just try harder, eat less, move more. If those were more successful, we would be bigger champions of people doing that, in isolation.
Hmm.
But unfortunately, because of the modern environment and because most food related practices have at least some element of subconscious, you know, integration going on, they're just not that successful.
Yep.
And so ultimately, we want people to be successful and to put them on a better health trajectory. And so having additional resources can be useful. All right, let's wrap this up. The San Francisco lawsuit against Kraft Heinz and others is more than just a legal battle over cookies and soda. It is a reckoning with the idea that the personal responsibility defense has reached its expiration date. As the obesity epidemic has grown over the last 50 years, we've been told that health is a solo mission of macros and willpower. But the data shows that when you put a human in a precisely engineered environment, the outcome is predictable. And for most folks, it isn't good. The industry has spent decades using the playbook from big tobacco to ensure that the path of least resistance leads directly to the bliss point. They turn the satiety stoplights green and cut the brake lines, and then they blame the consumer for the crash. Proving that these foods are a public health nuisance isn't about calling people addicts, it's about acknowledging that human agency cannot thrive in a rigged environment. But as practitioners, we got to be honest. A decade-long courtroom drama won't fix your health tomorrow, and we cannot let silly targets like food dyes or seed oils distract us from the actual structural problems of energy density and food matrix integrity. We can't turn health into a luxury good that only the wealthy can afford. Now, ideally, this lawsuit would allow the food industry to create healthy, low-cost, desirable foods. But banning all hyperpalatable foods seemed problematic, perhaps creating a black market for these types of food, as if we were back in the Prohibition era. Future concerns aside, what should you do now? Your action plan is to stop playing defense against a rigged food environment and start playing offense on your microenvironment. When you shop for food, aim to limit how much hyperpalatable, ultra-processed foods you buy. Using willpower once a week is likely to be more successful than doing it every day after the kids are asleep. Don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. Not all processed food is bad. If a processed food provides 30% or more of its calories from protein and has more than 1 gram of fiber per 10 grams of carbohydrates, it can be a tool for your success, not a trap for your satiety. You can engineer your own environment, use friction, put high reward foods out of sight and high satiety tools at eye level. Turn your home and your desk into a micro oasis. You can reclaim your signaling by eating undistracted. Let your brain hear the signals your gut is trying to send. And if all of those signals are still not quite right, speak to your physician about additional tools, whether it's therapy, metabolic bariatric surgery, or anti-obesity medications. We now have to repair them. The city of San Francisco is suing to fix the environment for the community. But until that bridge is fixed, you are the architect of your own environment. Let's go to work. For Dr. Austin Baraki and the entire team at Barbell Medicine, I'm Dr. Jordan Feigenbaum. Thanks for listening. We'll see you next week on the Barbell Medicine Podcast.